In the heart of Alaska's Chugach mountain range, three young men set out to scale Eagle Peak in 1984. Energetic and in their early 20s, they were just starting to figure out life when a massive avalanche turned their adventure into a desperate fight for survival. This harrowing experience forever altered their paths in life, illustrating how a single moment can redefine everything. This tale isn't about just survival, but the profound and long-lasting impact of the brutality of nature. This is a story of Joe Yelverton. Joe Yelverton was a true Alaskan at heart. His passion for the mountains were as vast as the landscape itself. Since childhood, he was irresistibly drawn to the untamed beauty, spending every opportunity outside climbing, hiking, and skiing. At 19, Joe met Steve, who would soon become his best friend. Their shared love for the outdoors forged an instant and unbreakable bond. They spent their days working together at a local sports store and every other moment exploring the mountains. But despite their deep bond, their friendship hit a rough patch when Steve expressed his disappointment with Joe's treatment of the women in his life. Joe, a self-admitted player, was initially defensive and angry at Steve. He even thought it might be the end of their friendship. But as he reflected, Joe realized that Steve's point was valid. Determined to not lose his best friend, Joe proposed that they take on a challenging ascent of Eagle Peak together. They'd been eyeing the route for a while, and he hoped that the climb would accomplish a couple of things. It would test their physical limits, which they love to do, but it would also give them a chance to rebuild the trust and strengthen their bond as friends. Eagle Peak, just east of Anchorage, towers at 6,900 feet. Its jagged peaks and glaciers, a majestic backdrop to the alpine meadows below. It's one of the highest peaks in the surrounding area, and it's popular among hikers and climbers year-round. Its summit offers a grueling challenge, a 21-mile round trip, scaling a near vertical mile, and it's a technical ice climb in winter and spring. It can be climbed in a day, but a very long day. In the spring of 1984, Joe, Steve, and their friend Barry embarked on the ascent of Eagle Peak. Despite April's lingering winter grip and fresh snow heightening avalanche risks, they were determined. They reached the base of the mountains, setting camp under a fresh blanket of snow, with the promise of a quintessential Alaskan day ahead. They were experienced enough to know that the avalanche danger was high, but they thought they could mitigate the danger by staying on the rock and avoiding the loaded snow slopes. The next morning, under a brilliant blue sky and 8 inches of new snow, they started their ascent, weaving through rocky areas to avoid avalanches. Around noon, as Barry scouted out ahead, Joe and Steve paused on a ledge. The vastness of Alaska spread out before them. It was there, amidst the serenity of the mountains, that Joe opened up. He expressed his love and respect for Steve, acknowledging the validity of his concerns and vowing to change. Their conversation, heartfelt and sincere, marked a turning point in Joe's personal growth and their friendship. As they sat, shoulders touching, the weight of their recent conflict lifted. They shared sandwiches and the breathtaking view, their bond strengthened by the honesty and vulnerability that they'd shown. This climb was more than just a physical feat. It was a journey of reconciliation set against the majestic backdrop of Eagle Peak. After lunch, Joe and Steve were gearing themselves up for the next phase of the climb. Joe had just put his pack on his back, cinched it at the waist, and grabbed his ice axe. Steve was gearing up just a few feet in front of him. And in an instant, a massive explosion shattered the calm. Joe knew immediately what the sound was. It was an avalanche. Joe reacted instinctively. He dropped and anchored himself with his ice axe, but Steve was slower to react, caught off guard by the oncoming wall of snow, and he was flung off the mountain.
And I looked up and saw about probably a 7 to 10 foot wave hit us.
The snow started piling up on top of Joe, and he tried to hang on, but it started building up between him and the mountain. He tried balling himself up as small as he could, hoping the snow would pass him and not drag him down the mountain. But the avalanche was a monstrous force. A deafening rush like a freight train swept Joe off the cliff. Tumbling over the edge, he felt a terrifying weightlessness at the mercy of the tidal wave of snow. Joe ended up going over a series of cliffs which they had just climbed earlier that morning. He kept tumbling down the mountain, bouncing off rocks and feeling jolts of pain every time he smashed into them. For the next 20 seconds, he was pummeled down the mountain, but he knew that he had to keep moving. He remembered the survival technique of swimming on top of the snow to stay afloat, so he kept doing that, desperately trying not to get buried. All the while he was choking as snow was entering his mouth and going down his throat, and he was certain he was going to die. And then it all stopped. And miraculously, Joe wasn't buried. His legs were trapped and broken, a horrific sight that sent him into a panic. He frantically started searching for his friends, and then he looked over and spotted Steve's clothes in the distance, but Steve wasn't moving. And he wasn't responding to Joe's desperate calls. Collapsing in pain, Joe realized that his legs couldn't support him, so he started yelling and yelling at Steve, which was difficult because he couldn't get much air into his lungs. Barry, having narrowly escaped, rushed down to them. And soon he confirmed the unthinkable, that Steve didn't make it. Barry then hurried to Joe, quickly moving him away from the danger zone of further avalanches. He wrapped him in a sleeping bag, covered him with every item that he had left in his bag, and left him all of his gear and promised to return with help. Alone for hours, Joe's mind oscillated between hope and despair, hallucinations blurring reality as he lay in agonizing pain, haunted by the repeated image of Steve's lifeless body.
But when I was awake, it was pretty tormenting because, I could still see Steve just above me on the mountain. And I was starting to hallucinate. And I would wake up from what I thought was a dream, and I would see that his body was gone. And then I would start looking for him around me. And then I would gain consciousness, and I realized that I was having these hallucinations. So it was pretty disturbing.
Barry returned after an agonizing 10 hours, and it was nothing short of heroic. The helicopter's arrival marked the end of Joe's ordeal on Eagle Peak. Despite his extensive injuries, including a broken leg and back, Joe began his very long and winding road back to recovery. Physically, Joe healed, but the mental scars lingered, hidden and unacknowledged for years. He grappled with PTSD marked by anxiety, flashbacks, and profound reactions to noise. Seeking a fresh start, Joe left Alaska, his memories, and the past behind him, and he set out for Seattle.
I left Alaska because I wanted to try and get away from my memories.
But the shadows of that fateful day followed him. He couldn't escape them.
At that point, my flashbacks had morphed into much more violent episodes involving explosions, and I would see car bombs going off, buildings exploding with me inside of them.
After a challenging 15 years, Joe realized that he finally needed professional help. Therapy became his beacon, guiding him through the trauma.
I started making some headway with a really great therapist, and I'll never forget what she said to me. She said, you're never going to get your old life back.
His healing journey eventually led him back to Alaska, where he discovered a new passion in photography. Through the lens, he found a way to not only tell the stories of others, but also his own. Joe's personal account, detailed in an essay for Outside magazine, was titled, "I Survived an Avalanche in 1984. It took me decades to pick up the pieces." It's a profound exploration of the enduring trauma and the slow path to healing. His story emphasizes that survival extends far beyond the immediate aftermath of a crisis. These survival narratives captivate us perhaps because they echo our own fears and remind us of life's fragility. But Joe's story urges us to look deeper and beyond the event to the lasting impact on the survivors and their loved ones. It's a reminder to approach these stories with empathy and understanding, and to recognize the long-term journey for those who endure these life-altering events. It's not just about the struggle to survive in the moment, it's about the resilience required to rebuild and find meaning in the aftermath of these incidents. These are tales of true endurance, of the human spirit's capacity to overcome and find new paths forward. But Joe's story, it urges us to look deeper beyond that event and look at the lasting impact on him and his loved ones. So if you enjoy this story about survival, check out the video on Matt Dyer, who was attacked by a polar bear in remote northern Canada.
Before he knew it, he was in the jaws of a polar bear who was galloping down the beach with his head in its mouth.
It wasn't just about that struggle in the moment, it was about the resilience and what was required to rebuild his life in the aftermath.